Welcome, everybody, to Roll for Healing, the Therapeutic Game Master Roundtable. By show of hands, raise your hand if you have heard of Game to Grow, the nonprofit organization. I love seeing that many hands up, filling the room over here in this gigantic room. Game to Grow, for those of you that don't know, is a nonprofit organization based here in the greater Seattle area. Our mission is to use games of all kinds for therapeutic, educational, and community growth. What we're most well known for is our therapeutic social skills groups, using Dungeons and Dragons. We actually have 8 weekly therapeutic Dungeons and Dragons groups across the greater Seattle area. We're actually expanding to Tacoma. We're also expanding to include adult groups and groups that use Magic the Gathering and Minecraft. So it's a very exciting time for our nonprofit. In addition to that, part of our mission is also to train teachers and therapists and doctors to use games better with their clients. Over the last year, we've helped over 400 people receive continuing education credits for learning about Dungeons and Dragons. It's pretty fantastic. And not only that, we come to conferences and conventions around the country as part of our mission to raise awareness about the life-enriching magic of games. Raise your hand if you think games have improved your life. I thought you might think that. That is why Game to Grow exists. If you'd like to support our mission, I can't, as an executive director of a nonprofit, not tell you to please go to gametogrow.org/support. And anything you can provide to us will help us expand our groups even farther. And if you're here at PAX, we actually have a table in the 6th floor of the expo hall where you can pick up a penny pin and a life cog, which is a fundraising hit point tracker made by Level Up Dice to support our mission. So please stop by our booth 7609, talk to us a little bit more about that. Without further ado, I have an amazing panel of experts right here who have all used games, specifically Dungeons and Dragons, to improve the lives of their players. So the first thing I would like to do is have our panelists introduce themselves, their name, their qualifications, and how they have used games to improve the lives of their players.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth Kilmer. I have a master's degree in clinical psychology, and I'm finishing up my doctorate. I'll be done by August, if everything goes well. Thanks. I am currently a pre-doctoral intern at the American Lake VA, just south of Tacoma, and I am starting a group right now using Dungeons and Dragons therapeutically with veterans there. If you're a veteran and you're interested, let me know. I also have started groups at the Dallas Children's Advocacy Center and the Dallas VA.
I'm Dr. Jared Kilmer, and I am a clinical psychologist. Just moved up here to Washington to work with Game to Grow, but before that, I was down in Texas implementing programs that use role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons therapeutically at the Waco VA and the Dallas VA.
I'm Peter Jung. I have a master's in education from the University of Washington, Tacoma. I was working for a foster care agency for about 5 years using a lot of games in that context. And then I moved on to work for Aspiring Youth, where I've been running games with them for about 5 years. We have done mostly autism groups and similar groups. I recently did a girls group that was hugely successful in Tacoma, and we are looking at opening a Tacoma group as opposed to our usual Seattle, King County groups. So that's happening. And aside from that, I run the blog Roll for Kindness, where I talk about kind of how to use games in a more ethical way, how to build kind of kindness and kind of the antidote to the murder hobo, so to say.
I like that a lot. I'm Adam Johns. I'm the other executive director of Game to Grow. Game to Grow has been around for a little while now, but Adam and I have been doing this work of using role-playing games in an intentionally therapeutic way for about 8 years. And so I've been doing that in addition to having I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. And Adam and I met in grad school pursuing our different masters and combining a lot of the same ideas into Game to Grow. I would also be remiss if I didn't at least mention that Game to Grow recently had a successful Kickstarter called Critical Core.
If you knew my
I did not
deck.
coordinate this. Critical Core is a take-home kit for parents and teachers and therapists to learn how to play role-playing games if they've never played a role-playing game before, but with modules and a facilitator's guide to really emphasize the idea of building social skills and social capacities, especially related to challenges around autism, anxiety, and ADHD. Basically, the work we do in sort of a starter set to get it out into a lot more people's hands. So we're excited. We're in development now for getting that into everybody's hands. And so I'm really excited for that. And if you are interested, you can still pre-order it on our backer kit. If you go to criticalcore.org, it'll take you to the Kickstarter, which will take you to the backer kit.
It's like 3 clicks you have.
There's a few clicks. You guys can do it.
Awesome. So a couple of important things to notice is everybody up here has letters after their name that are their credentials, the reasons why they are qualified to do this kind of work. Everybody here either has credentials or some sort of contract with their players, so their players know what they're getting out of this. So I want to be super clear that this is not a training in how to use therapeutic role-playing games. If you're interested in that, please contact us, but this is not a training, so please don't go do therapy on your friends. It's not going to turn out well. So that's one important thing I want to say. Another important thing that I want to say is that the panelists are going to be telling stories about the games that they have run. Know that they are changing the demographic information to protect the privacy of their clients. It's important for you all to know. The other important thing is that there's a lot of letters after everybody's names up here, and sometimes we slip into jargon or terminology. So if that happens, I want to empower you to hold up a T like this for terminology. So if I say scaffolded and aesthetically distanced play-based narrative transference, you might want to throw up a T. Perfect. And if you want to understand that, come to a training. The first question I have for you is, you all are therapeutic game masters who use RPGs in an applied setting. You have a room of gamers here. How do you tell gamers what makes this different than a regular D&D session at a board game store or in somebody's house?
Do you mind if I take this?
Actually, before you talk, Peter, I'm going to encourage you to do one thing. This is the round table, not the panelists taking turns answering questions panel. So what I encourage you guys to do is build on each other's ideas. And I'm going to encourage you to do this the same way I used to with my 4th grade students. And I would like you to say, I'd like to build on what Peter said, when you're going to build on what Peter said. And I would like you guys, as operant conditioning here, to when they do that, I want you to say, hip hip hooray! Go ahead, Peter.
So I'd like to build on what Adam said. So when you're working with kind of an applied RPG or a therapeutic RPG, you have this additional sort of, I don't want to say baggage, but job to do. And that becomes such a critical part of what you're doing. It's very intentional. It's very kind of behind the scenes. So I spend about 3 hours in prep for every 2 hours or so of gaming. And about 2.5 of those hours are thinking about, okay, what are the specific behaviors I want to work on? What is this kid, what do they want? What are they trying to get out of this? And how can I kind of make those things come together? I don't spend that much time on the story, on the gameplay mechanics, because that's not what's important. Whereas kind of a normal game, you would want to spend that 3 hours on, okay, let's make some cool traps, let's make some, interesting NPCs. A lot of what I do is just recycling, and so I can really focus on those kind of specialized, applied aspects.
I want to build on what Peter said. And add in just the idea that a lot of the times the best description that I give for the differences in a regular gaming group and a therapeutic gaming group are very similar to the difference between having a friend and having a therapist. So you might go to your friend and they might support you through something really challenging. They might support you in many of the same ways that a therapist might, in the sense that they are helping you through that experience. They're giving you a safe place that you can talk about it. What a therapist does that is different from that is that they have an explicit contract with you. And that explicit contract means that the therapist is not there for you to take care of them. And it means that the therapist's goals are to get you through to the other side or get you toward your goals that you've set, that you've explicitly stated, that you've given and helped your therapist to understand. And those goals are an important piece, and the route to those goals is not always easy. When I sit down at a gaming table, I might say, I just want to have a fun time hanging out with my friends. But when I'm a therapeutic game master, I may push my players to have to do things they don't want to do. So that they can get through to the other side and can learn the skills necessary in order to be able to do those things later on in life or later on when they're with friends. And so that push and that contract are a lot of the big pieces.
I'd like to add on to what Adam said. Okay, I'm going to quickly stop using that language. Just like you have a different kind of relationship or contract with your therapist, your group may also look different. So has anybody ever played a game with their friends and they maybe changed their behaviors because they didn't want to do something that might then impact their friendships outside of the group? Or maybe you did something in a game that unintentionally impacted your relationship with your friends outside of the group? Yeah. So with kind of a therapeutic group, everybody is getting together for that game. A lot of times you won't have a relationship with those people outside of that group. And that can actually be really special and really helpful for therapy because it gives you a little bit more flexibility and freedom to try out new things in group. Maybe you can be a little bit more vulnerable. You can share things you wouldn't necessarily share because you were afraid of rejection somewhere else. You can try on new parts of yourself, or you can learn like, oh, this behavior that I have been doing all the time in my life isn't working for me, and I'm able to get the feedback that I need about that in this group because I'm with a group of people that are all working towards those same goals, and I'm not worried that then I'm gonna have an awkward lunch with them later. Does that kind of make sense?
And I'd like to build on what Elizabeth just said. And I actually find that very reinforcing. Thank y'all. But nailed it. The only thing I'd want to add is the therapeutic contract is often collaborative, which isn't necessarily the way that would work in a home game. We want to work with you to get you towards your goals, but they're not goals that we as therapists are just identifying and saying should be your goals. They're the goals of the client, and we're working together to build those. And you won't always see that outside of a therapeutic context.
And it's okay if you don't know what all of your goals are when you start.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm hearing you guys talk a lot about how these games can be so beneficial, and the gamers in the room totally know this. But a lot of questions we get, Game to Grow is asked a lot, is how do I explain this to somebody who's not a gamer? We hear from a lot of teachers who want to run a group in their school, or clinicians who want to run a group at their clinic, and they have maybe a apprehensive supervisor or principal. How do you talk about this? Like, I'm going to put Adam on the spot for a second here. Adam explained this to my dad in a way that was super effective, because I'm like, I'm a role-playing gamer, that's my job, and I told my dad this, and he's like, okay, how do you make money doing that? And then Adam came to dinner and told it to my dad was like, got it, understand it now. So how do you talk to parents, teachers, administrators about this? I'm putting you on the spot, Adam, but anybody can answer this.
So Adam's dad, the way that I like to explain this is really that it's about the approach for the person that you're talking with. My experience, my background, I've been playing role-playing games since I was 10. I'm deeply seeped in the jargon and in the parts of gaming. But I talk to a lot of parents who, when I say, have you heard of Dungeons and Dragons before? They go, oh yeah, that video game where you hit stuff with swords, right? And I go, well, that's close. And I think a lot of it is about being able to connect the gap. What you're trying to do is you're trying to build a bridge between where they're at and where you're at. And a lot of times helping to build that bridge needs to start from where they are, not from where you are. And so a lot of times when I explain this, the way that I start is I say, well, it's basically a bunch of people sitting at a table. There are no screens involved. And they're playing a game where they're telling a story together, and they're sort of taking turns telling the story. There's one person who acts as we call them the game master or the dungeon master, and they're sort of the lead storyteller. They describe something that happens in the world, and then all the other players get to add to that story by describing what their characters in that world do. And that's really a very basic foundation for an understanding of that. And then we can get into, we roll dice, that helps add some randomness to the world, and it's exciting. It's often a fantasy world like Lord of the Rings or lots of other fantasy settings, and because of that there's lots of magic and mystery, and you're an adventurer in that world, and it's exciting to be able to sit down, but it's all done at a table where you're having a fun time hanging out with your friends.
I kind of like to, adding onto what Adam said, thank you.
Conditioning works.
Yay. I'm being conditioned. So I go straight for the narrative, because ultimately D&D is about telling stories, and we all have a wealth of stories that we can pull from. And my favorite story that kind of illustrates the beauty of what we do is the story of this one kid who was very quiet, and his head was always down, he's always kind of, inside himself, and, I'd be lucky to get maybe 2 words out of him. And when he started, I saw his character sheet, and it was packed, just full of text. I'm just like, okay, this is really interesting. He's this dwarven warrior who's got this dark past that he's trying to escape from, and he's just, really gritty. I'm like, okay, this should be really interesting. So we had a scenario where they had this guy who had witnessed a mob hit, and the guy didn't want to talk. He was scared that the mob was going to start going after him. And suddenly, this kid who had barely said a word looks me in the eye, puts his arms out, taking up half the table, holding this, air axe, says, "All right, listen here, Sonny. You best answer the elf's question, or you'll be dealing with me, all right? And it won't be as fun." I'm like, okay, you get a +10 to that intimidation roll and advantage, because that was cool. And from that point on, I started introducing lots of scenarios where people were kind of nervous to talk, because, the mob was going to hit him. So again, he would go, "All right, Sonny." And it got to the point where he kind of became the party face, the leader of the party. Everyone would just look to him and like, "All right, time to do this thing." And I saw him just more and more take it more and more of the table. So even when he wasn't in, "I'm going to go scare people with my angry Scottish voice and big axe," he was still taking up a lot of the table, looking at people, getting excited, suggesting things, and it was just amazing to see. And that's why I do what I do, and I think a lot of people connect with that.
So we take a little bit of a different approach, in part because of who we're talking to. So a lot of times we're talking to other psychologists, we're talking to our bosses at the VA, trying to convince them that they should let us run games as part of our job. Or we're talking to veterans or kids who maybe don't have any kind of fantasy or game background. So for somebody who has never read Harry Potter or doesn't know what Lord of the Rings is or has never picked up a video game, jumping in and saying like, "Isn't this cool, exciting world going to be awesome?" can be really overwhelming. So a lot of times we'll start off talking about some of the benefits that we've seen with our players. We'll use words like cognitive flexibility and interpersonal effectiveness, things that they're coming in saying, "Hey, I want help with these things." And then we'll talk about how those things can relate to the game or how they can have the chance to practice. We find that that's generally pretty effective, especially when there's that disconnect, that complete lack of understanding about what could fantasy be or what can it mean.
Mm-hmm. To build on what Elizabeth just said, I think we both have been reinforced to start with the benefits and just talk about the role-playing game as the vector to get us from where we are to that end state. I think we have found largely a lot of success with that. People, like, the results speak for themselves, and quickly, a lot of the skeptical people in our lives don't care how we got there as long as those results are produced, whether that's the veterans we're serving or the administrators. We ended up getting a lot of support.
Yeah, and that's something with, when we look at a lot of our therapeutic interventions, a role-playing game like Dungeons & Dragons really maps on really well. So it's not that we're taking this game and we're really like adjusting it or fitting it that much. We've got this great intervention called group therapy. I tend to work from an interpersonal process approach with that. Doesn't matter if you don't know what that means. But to people who kind of are familiar with that approach, when I start talking about how it relates to Dungeons & Dragons, it tends to be a really easy transition. And they start to kind of catch on a lot faster, even if they don't know what the game is.
So what I'm hearing you saying is what Adam started with is speaking the language that people need to hear to understand it. We're not necessarily talking about Dungeons and Dragons, we're talking about outcomes. We're talking about the language that person hearing it. And then, Peter, I heard you talk about telling stories as being really super effective. Most of that, and Elizabeth, you talked a little bit about how you speak to the player and participant themselves a little bit around how to get them involved. My next question is, how do you tell a player that this is a social improvement exercise, or do you kind of keep that behind the scene? How do you get a player to come into a group and then use that group to grow?
So I've worked mostly, well, I guess half and half with adults and kids. Most of my clients have not had a fantasy background. And so they're coming in actively seeking help for certain things. And so we'll have really explicit conversations about kind of what are your goals? What are the things in your life that are not working for you? And sometimes they say, "I don't know." So one of the goals is like gaining insight into that. So I tend to have really explicit conversations with players themselves, whether they're adults or adolescents, about what their goals are and how the group can be helpful. We also will have some kind of more formal processing time, which means time where we kind of set down the screen and we talk about what's happening, either right now or what happened today. And that's time for people to kind of bring in their own goals as they want.
I'm going to build on what Elizabeth was saying. We see, so in that same idea, a lot of it really depends, I think, in the question on what kind of clients that you have coming in.
Absolutely.
A lot of the kids and teens that are attending Game to Grow groups are burnt out on therapy. And we see, if you guys are familiar with the term therapy burnout, it basically is what happens when you're in therapy for a long, long time and you feel like you're not making progress, or you feel like it's not necessarily serving you well. Oftentimes you give up on therapy, and that doesn't always mean you stop attending. That just means you gave up. So we're seeing a lot of clients that come in with that same similar attitude where they're like, not another therapy group. And it really helps to have a different context to it. So we don't ever hide it in the sense of saying, if they ask or if they're involved and they're like, is this a therapy group? We'll say, yeah, it absolutely is. And then we're also going to have a really fun time playing some Dungeons and Dragons together. And oftentimes that can be a nice hurdle. It can be a nice bump to help get them through that first session. And usually by the end of the first session, they are engaged. I'm actually going to steal a story that Adam Davis usually tells. But we had a group where we had signed up the younger of two siblings to come and attend a group. And it just so happened to be that the older sibling came along with them and was hanging out in the lobby, and we had an extra spot in the group. We said, why don't the both of you come back and we'll get you both made up on characters. And the older sibling said yes, and that sounds great. And they both came back and we had a fun time. They made characters. We played the first session of D&D. And after the first session, the parent pulled Adam Davis aside and was like, what did you do? And Adam was like, we talked about this on the phone. We played D&D. And she said, my kids don't ride in the car together. They don't eat dinner together. They won't talk to each other. How did you get them to clearly have a good time and come out smiling from the same room together? And it turns out it was that they had been told, the parent had been told by a psychotherapist that the older sibling would never be able to operate in a social group and would need years of therapy before they ever got to that place. And apparently we did it in an hour-and-a-half long session of D&D. And it was somewhat unintentional. That was an invite in, and from there we got goals, we got a better idea for who they were, but that was just an opportunity to be able to connect in this fun space and on this fun level. And it was, now those two are the best of friends and fierce allies. And in a brand new goal setting kind of way, sometimes really hesitant about new members who are joining the group, and they bond together to protect each other from new people who join. And that's great. What an amazing shift for them to now have in this brand new direction, to be supporting each other rather than battling each other.
Building on what Adam says, you're bringing up goals, and I think there is a certain amount of attention you pay to explicit goals and plot goals or player goals, and then your goals as an applied RPG specialist or a therapist or whatever. So one thing I will ask a lot is, okay, what do you want to see more of next quarter? And interestingly enough, it's been Phoenix Wright stuff. I had a kidnapping scenario where all the kids were, combing over everything and then going to trial with it. And the kids love that. So they said they wanted more of that, and also more pro wrestling. So I had to add that. And also more Japanese dating sim. So it's gotten weird. It's gotten real weird. Autumn, high memories. When you are able to address these specific goals, you can start hitting a lot of these other things because they feel like they're seen, they feel like they have a sense of agency and belonging in this game, and even almost control over this game. And so meanwhile, I can start slipping in things like, okay, now y'all all have to spend 30 minutes just discussing how you're gonna take this thing to trial. And here are kids that might not really have an easy time talking, and they will be in a deep debate about like the legal defense and, okay, but at this point we're got this surprise package and see, it was actually the count all along. And I'm sitting back, I'm just watching this happen for like a half hour at a time. It's amazing. And all that is because I can kind of work around their explicit goals while working in our kind of therapeutic aligned goals.
I'm reminded of a story, but I admit I need the question reprompted to me.
So the question was about how do you deal with players? Do you tell them explicitly this is a therapeutic group? You kind of keep it secret? And the sort of next question that I have embedded in here, building on what Peter just said. Thank you. Can we give them a hip hip hooray real quick?
Hip, hip,
Hooray!
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's exhausting
You guys are
giving
good.
everybody else support all
Yeah.
the time. I understand that. So the question I have for you guys, in addition, building on what Peter just said, it's okay. You don't need to. Very well reinforced over here. Is how will you get player buy-in? Like, so we have how do you talk to them about this? But do you have any tips or tricks as a game master when players come in to give them a hook to make them want to keep playing?
Don't wear suits.
Don't wear suits. So the answer to that question does depend on the context. Like when Elizabeth and I have worked within the VA, the pitch to our players is usually very, very explicit. We often have the opportunity to have relationships with our players outside of that room, whether that's because we're running other groups that they're in, or we're their individual therapist, or we're just working within a program where they're also working, and so we get to meet each other, we get to know each other, we get to know what their personal goals already are. So we can start with that outcome. Like, hey, I know you want to work on reducing isolation, or I know you want to work on problem solving or creativity. I think I have something that could be really helpful for that. And whether they raise an eyebrow at what role-playing games are or not, we already have the opportunity for them to trust us and want to try it anyway. When we have done this with adolescents in private practice, a lot of that communication was with the parents, and when we had the opportunity with the kids, but often that would just trickle down from what the parents understood from us, and the kids would come in hopeful, but maybe a little bit confused, all the way to an extreme one time when we were about 10 minutes into our very first session, and this one kid comes in late, and he's immediately looks confused about what's going on, and he just introduces himself and then sits quietly, and he looks very intent about like trying to figure out why this doesn't look like the therapy he was expecting. And it's day one. We didn't want to bog them down with what is Dungeons and Dragons and how to make a character. We just passed out character sheets to everybody, and he got on board with that near instantly, like it was made for him, like it was second nature. But at the end, we were just processing, and he was giving feedback, and he said, I walked in and I was prepared for you guys to be in suits, and we would have to talk about our feelings, and I was ready to have like a really bad time and like just be super rude. I don't care. And this is none of that. And like I don't know if he ever fully believed what was happening was happening. Did I leave anything out of that?
I don't think so. This is the person who regularly in his life would decide before he started that he was going to have a bad time. This wasn't going to end well. And that was actually, for this kid, he had a pretty rough time up into age like 13. It wasn't unreasonable for him to expect that new experiences were going to be negative. But what that also meant was any experience that had the chance to be positive, he kind of shut that down. So he, throughout the group, got to gain a little bit of insight, got to get a little bit of feedback from people, and then would kind of come in and bring in experiences. So this was another person who did not get along with his brother, thought his brother was like awful and not okay, and we would just hear kind of story after story after story. And about after session 3 or 4, he came in and he was like, so my brother and I went to a game store and now we're playing D&D by ourselves outside of this group, and we're friends now. We're like, okay, cool.
Kind of building off of that, really of what Elizabeth said. I think there's also value to having long-running groups, because if you have 4 players that have been there for a long time and then a new player comes in, they can kind of bring them in and start saying, hey, this group's really amazing. And so I think to some degree, if you can stagger groups a little bit, that's awesome. In fact, this one time I had a new kid come in, and this one kid who had been in the group for 4 years was just kind of introducing him to stuff, and I was telling them the history of the world. So like, yeah, and then this time they accidentally caused an ice age, and at this point, the god of standardized testing took over half the planet, and blah, blah, blah. And this kid who had been there for a long time looks at this new kid and says, he's not making that up. We actually did that. And I kind of had to stop from saying, like, actually, I did make all that up. But, but it's just this sort of powerful moment when he said, yeah, we did that. And now you get to do that with us, too. And that, I think, really helps buy-in, really helps kids get really excited, thinking, God, I can't wait for my shot to defeat the god of standardized testing, who is still around. He's still at large, unfortunately. I may have to kill him.
You can never defeat the god of standardized testing.
Fine.
To build on what Peter said, I think that one of the things that we really like to do in groups, and I think a lot of game masters do this actually, we call narrative transference.
I got a T for terminology, Adam.
Perfect. What a great demonstration. Thank you. So transference is a term that's used in therapy a lot. It's basically when you, as a person who's attending therapy, project your unconscious thoughts, feelings, and desires onto someone else, onto your therapist. And when that process happens, there's lots of processing that you can do with it. Often really good therapists will use it as a part of the therapy, as a way to help you move past through your goals and recognize it and call it out. Narrative transference is when that happens as a result of plot and story and characters. This is actually something that happens a lot in other situations. If you go see a Pixar movie and you find yourself crying at the opening, because and when that happens, that is narrative transference. You're experiencing emotions that have come up as a result of the plot and characters and things like that have happened in the movie. This also happens in game settings. Whenever you are emotionally engaged in the story that's happening, in the characters that exist in the world, that is a moment of narrative transference. And we'll use this sometimes in a very purposeful way to help get players really engaged into what's going on. My favorite example of this is the Seamus Soup Kitchen example. Has anybody heard the Seamus story? Because I've told it a bunch of times. Okay, I'm going to tell it again. Here's how the setup sort of goes. We do a very classic tavern setup. Everybody comes into the tavern. They come in and they sit down and they get greeted by the tavern owner. Now, we don't have alcohol in our games, so everybody drinks soup, frothy golden soup from mugs. And as they come in, they meet Seamus. And Seamus is incredibly friendly. Seamus welcomes them in. He says, "Oh, welcome, come on in, have a great time, have a seat. That's a huge sword you have there." He remarks on the stuff the players have with them on the backstory, like, "Whoa, that's a big scar and a very emo haircut." And he helps you get settled, and then he offers you soup. He says, "What can I get for you?" And no matter what soup you order, Seamus has it. He's a spectacular soup maven. And so when you come in and you say, "I want dragon eyeball soup," he's like, "Dragon eyeball, I've got a family recipe. It's really, really good. It's very chewy." Or if you say, "I want fire soup," he will make you fire soup. When you say wild soups like potato leek soup, he's got it. And so when the player sits in, they go, "I want nothing." And he goes, "Nothing soup. It's so light and airy. I'll have a bowl out right for you in a second." And then he does that for all the players, and they all get greeted, and then all of a sudden, the tavern becomes under attack. And there are skeletons attacking all the players, and a man in black armor bursts through the wall and kills Seamus. And that moment, from then on, the players absolutely hate that man in black armor. And hate is a powerful emotion. Hate and love, those things, those moments are powerful threads that you can pull on, that you can use to help bond your players together. And we see a lot of socially isolated kids that don't get along well with other people, that have trouble interacting. And when they sit down at a table and they're eyeing each other and they're like, I'm not sure about all of this, that moment where Seamus gets stabbed by the man in black armor, they no longer have uneasy feelings about the other people at the table because they know now we're all teammates and we're all going to work together to get that guy. And that moment is a really powerful tool for getting everybody engaged in the game itself.
Building off what Adam said, I'm fascinated that you kill an NPC right off the bat.
That's, I guess, to be fully fair, we run groups with 8-year-olds and 9-year-olds. I don't always kill Seamus. Sometimes he just gets stabbed, and then they have to go on a quest to heal him, and then he gets bound spiritually into a deck of cards that they carry around with them forever.
Oh, good, a deck of many things.
And one other time, Adam, they used a necromancer to bring back a part of Seamus.
They brought back his head. And then they had to carry Seamus's head around everywhere, and they had him in a bag, and they would pull him out to recite soup recipes every once in a while. And he was very sad he couldn't make soup anymore, so he had to have the players make soup for him.
Well, I think, Adam, this is a really great example of how your population, your group matters so much. So having an understanding of what it is that is going to bring your group together can be really meaningful. If you ever want a group of veterans to get along, have a kid be kidnapped. There's no more questions. They will do whatever needs to happen. It doesn't matter what the risk or reward situation is. They will get that kid back. There are other things you can use too, but it's the driving forces behind your different groups are going to be a little bit different. So it's important to pay attention to that.
I'd love for you to expand on that a little bit more, Elizabeth. Like what kinds of...
Yeah.
You have worked with adults, and remind the audience just how...
I have worked from ages 8 through 87, I'm pretty sure.
I imagine 8-year-olds and 87-year-olds have a different presentation in groups.
Just a little bit. There are some similarities. So when I worked with adolescent girls, one of their big challenges was whenever we'd kind of come up where maybe there was some conflict in the groups and people weren't getting along with the way things were running, they didn't want to address that, right? That's uncomfortable. I don't want to tell someone that you're doing something I don't like. And so they would be like, oh, we're just going to go down 2 different hallways. And I was like, guys, haven't you seen horror movies? No. So, but that doesn't help me, right? It's more complicated to run. And I want them to learn that we can have conflict, we can talk about things and we can resolve that and nobody's gonna die, right? It's important to be able to manage conflict in your friend groups and within your family. So for them, they were really invested in getting this magical wand that had been broken into 3 different pieces. They were really on board with that already. But to get them to come back together, I gave them a magical divining rod. Well, there's only 1 rod, and you need it to find all 3 pieces, which means that you're not able to split up. So they worked with that rod to go to each of those places. Then I started working with veterans, and I was like, oh, obviously they're gonna split up too. That's what people do when there's conflict. Yeah, no, they don't split up at all. I don't know what I was thinking. It's very against any training, ever. So for them, a lot of the things that we were pushing were, especially when I was working with veterans that had a history of trauma or PTSD or substance abuse problems, a lot of them had really negative self-images. They thought they were like really awful human beings who weren't deserving of good relationships. They thought that they had ruined everything good that had ever happened in their lives. That there wasn't a reason to trust anybody, and they definitely shouldn't be trusted. So one of the really cool things that we got to do with them was, again, they will rescue any child that is in peril or kidnapped or anything, right? Even if there's not a reward. So on paper, their character might say that they're lawful evil and they don't care about anybody and they only do things for money. But then you give them the opportunity to rescue a kid who's been stolen from a village by goblins, and the villagers say, we really like this kid, but we don't have any money to share. Honestly, we don't even have like food or a place for you to sleep. So there's literally nothing you can get out of saving this child. And the groups will go and do it every single time. And so then we get this really cool place where I get to kind of push and challenge and say, man, did you just do a really bad job of playing your character? Or is your character not as evil as you originally thought? Or has your character grown, right? And then they've got that space to say, oh yeah, I just did a bad job playing my character. He's still a horrible person and no one should trust him. Or they can say, yeah, he grew. But those really cool things don't get to happen unless you really get to know your players and their motivations.
And to build off of what Elizabeth was just saying. Sorry guys, that gets me every time.
I like it every time. It's great.
One of the big differences I noticed with working with adults is they've been alive for so much longer by default, and the beliefs they have about themselves have
the difference between adults and kids. Adults have been alive so much longer than kids.
Sometimes they're taller too.
I should have just.
Sometimes they have beards.
I should have just leaned back and ended right there. But sometimes we have beliefs about ourselves, whether they're adaptive or they're maladaptive, accurate or inaccurate, that just get further and further entrenched the longer we believe them and we look for evidence that that's true. And so one of the most fun parts of working with adults in this context is seeing those light bulbs turn on for the very first time. I remember working with a Vietnam veteran who says, I haven't been creative or playful since I think the 70s. It's just not a part of me that I have flexed or practiced or been exposed to. And I went home after our first session and I wanted to make a character, and I thought about it for 4 hours, and then I got on the internet, which turned out great. But he was like, but I don't like the internet or computers. But I went to the library in the VA and I looked up different races in D&D to see what fit with me, and I made something. And he told me about this dragonborn barbarian that he made, which in no way followed any of the player's handbook recommendations for how that should go. Fantastically. I breathe fire and acid, and I can breathe underwater, and this is why. And he got into the biology of why that's legit and true for his character, and it was just so cool to see him be excited and creative for what he claims is the first time in decades. Or when we were working with individuals in recovery from substance use, and I don't know if anyone has ever experienced substance use or know anybody who has, but sometimes addiction can be such that everything else that you care about kind of falls to the wayside. And an individual can get very out of practice with other aspects of their life that are rewarding or fulfilling or matter to them.
And just have a hard time experiencing emotions like happiness or sadness or joy.
Mm-hmm. Which is often a motivator for substance use in the first place. I don't know if I can tolerate feeling that, so I'll make sure that I can't. And seeing our veterans come back in and say, I was just flipping through the channels the other night because I was bored, and there was a movie on the Sci-Fi Channel that I stopped, and I wanted to just give it 5 minutes to see if I liked it. And I did. And I've never bothered to watch the Sci-Fi Channel. But I had a really good time. And you could start to see him become more open-minded and interested in new activities. And he'd say things like, for the first time I watched this movie I haven't seen in 10 years, and I connected to the main character more than I ever had. I guess back then I wasn't used to walking in somebody else's shoes like I am now. And I'm able to see things from people's perspectives that I've never seen before.
We had another veteran who I think was also Vietnam era, who had a history of antisocial behavior and came in, and throughout the group, now he volunteers. He also is going through training to be a volunteer on the Veterans Crisis Line, which is a suicide and crisis hotline for veterans, which is amazing, right? This is someone who came in and he was like, I'm a terrible person. It's who I am, pretty comfortable with it. It's the way I'm gonna die. And we're like, okay, welcome to Dungeons and Dragons. And kind of throughout this group, it was really cool to see the impact that having a safe space to try out new things really impacted the rest of his life, right? In Dungeons and Dragons, he could try out being a nice guy to see, hey, am I gonna get stabbed in the back? How do other people respond to this, right? If one day he decides to be nice and then the next week he decides to be evil again, right? He has that flexibility without those real world consequences. But having that practice of trying out or flexing those new muscles made him go, yeah, I do wanna volunteer. Yeah, I do wanna try this out. And he came in our last group before we moved up here, and he was like, yeah, I think one of the things I really learned from this group is that like other people matter. He's like, I used to only think that I cared about kids and dogs, like those adults I don't care. He used some more colorful language, but I'm gonna cut that out for here. He said, I used to think I only cared about kids and dogs, and now I've realized that like even adults have a kid inside them, which makes them worth something, right? Like everybody is just trying as hard as they can, and they've all got that kid. And so I like shouldn't throw ball bearings out of my car when I'm mad on the highway. So.
Which was an older behavior.
Yeah, not recent, but it was really cool to get to see that really big shift. Like not only am I learning new things about myself, but I'm learning new things about other people. So this was a person who now had this willingness to say like, I wonder why that person did that, instead of automatically assuming it was for something negative.
So one thing that I'm noticing is we've spent most of our time talking about role-playing games, focusing on story, narrative transference. I'm curious a little bit about how you use the game itself, what mechanics you lean into or lean back from or replace, and how you use, I think everybody here uses Dungeons & Dragons, maybe some other games as well, but I'm curious how the mechanics play into the outcomes we're talking about.
So I've been doing this with the same group for 5 years, so I've had to do a lot of different mechanics. And for the longest time, I was incredibly open roleplay heavy. Just nothing but roleplay. In fact, this one time I had 4 or 5 sessions in a row that was just a complex ball. From my perspective, it was an Excel spreadsheet of what every single of like 60 NPCs was doing per every half hour. But it was just this very kind of open, complex roleplay where the kids had to kind of figure out who knew what, who was talking to who, and navigate a really complicated social situation. I'm never doing that again. That was a nightmare. But over time, interestingly enough, I have been finding that tactical gameplay has a lot of value, and the kids are really getting into that if you do it right. And kind of the ways to do it right are build up the narrative, have a lot of opportunities for role-playing, at least this is what has really worked for me, and then give them opportunities to play off each other's things. So for example, we had this one kid who generally only thought about his own spells, his own things, and how he could use Tensor's floating disc to throw or to drop 80 pounds of rocks onto people, or 800 pounds of rocks, and that was his thing. And then all of a sudden, I see him sitting next to the rogue and saying, hey, if I do this, it'll give you advantage. So when do you want it? And I started seeing these sort of teamwork building things, which had been a goal that I really wanted to work on because I had kind of exhausted a lot of the role-playing tools for that. And so ultimately, it's kind of a mix of, is it the right tool? Is it the right mechanic? And are your kids willing to buy into it? And with a group as long as mine, they want something different, so I kind of have to try new things. In fact, right now I'm doing a bunch of collaborative world building, which is completely not in the book at all, but the kids eat it up. They created their starting village for the next quarter, and it's a tourist trap theme park for that stupid Japanese dating sim. It was their idea.
Can you get like people in the theme park with like big heads that look like the dating sim characters?
Yes. So there's a whole cast of characters. There's the elderly principal, there's the rival from another town who just glowers all the time, there's the goofy best friend, there's the bland, faceless protagonist. He's my favorite.
I want to buy a mug and a shirt.
For Autumn High Memories.
Yeah.
Cool.
That's perfect.
I'll make it.
To build on what Peter said, we actually do a lot of modifications to the game. Mostly we throw rules just out the window whenever it suits us. One of the things that I really like to do, the combat in the game of Dungeons and Dragons can be a space where you get really creative, where you can do creative options, except if you really hold tight to the rules and you prevent people from being able to do those creative things because they are improvised weapons or because they are not necessarily the thing you're super good at. So if somebody wants to pick up a table and hit somebody with it, I would rather that be an interesting choice rather than a dumb choice. So we throw a lot of rules out the window in order to make sure that the story moves forward and the players' creative choices often get yes-anded and added to and get to be a part of the creative process. But one of the rules that I love that we made a sort of global change to for our groups is every group we do a check-in question at the beginning of the group, and we always have a bonus to the check-in question, and that bonus gives you what we call a bonus token instead of an inspiration token. And the bonus token is a little different because you can use it to re-roll rolls, but you can't use it on yourself. You can only use it on someone else's re-roll. And it really creates a space where all the players are ready and willing to have something they can immediately hand to the other player to say, yeah, give that one another try. And it immediately creates a collaborative space or a cooperative space where they know they're working on a team and they want to help show somebody else that they want to see them succeed at it. And it's 100% a mechanical benefit that they bring into the group. This thing that I give you is just because I can't use it on myself sometimes, but it still makes you feel like I'm supporting you, I'm seeing you, I'm giving you the chance to be more successful than you might have been otherwise. So that's a pretty small change, but one that has really suffused the group's steeped, which was the word I meant to use before, in the idea of a cooperative space. You guys have any other tips or tricks?
Yeah, so when I started groups, the first group I ran was with girls, and I thought like, oh, the character sheet is gonna be way too complicated, like we should make it more simplified, and so I made a simplified version, and Jared thought it was gonna be horrible, and he was right. So part of what I would say is know your group, right? But also at least the 5e character sheet is actually pretty straightforward. And so what we did was all of our characters get those character sheets, and then we just pay attention to the parts of the character sheets that are important until they're ready to learn more, right? If you've got a group of 8 kids, some of them probably really want to get into the weeds of understanding every single piece of that sheet. Others are gonna be like, okay, so there are big numbers here, and this is how I feel about myself, and this is the stuff that's in my bag. Cool, I don't think about anything else, right? And that's okay. So I would err on the side of play the game the way it's intended or the way that you already play it with your friends, and then make modifications as needed.
And I think to build off of what Elizabeth was saying, every group needs different modifications, more or less. And I think we both follow the 5e Player's Handbook.
Mostly.
Like the one rule in that book that's, I think, hands down the most important is that the entire book should be seen as guidelines, and you should do the thing that makes the most sense at your table or is the most fun. Everything else is just a polite recommendation. And really what I meant to build off of what you were saying was with the complicated sheets, some people really dig it, some people are overwhelmed, and it's a really cool opportunity to watch the players that are more comfortable, consume their sheet and then see somebody, like their peers, struggling and start to see them work together to understand what their sheet means or different ways that they can use abilities they didn't think about. And it's just another tool for teamwork and collaboration.
That's some great advice. And building on what Jared just said, thank you, I needed that. My next question is actually, I didn't prep you guys for, but, otherwise I would have slides for it. I'm wondering if you have a book recommendation or a YouTube video or something you would suggest to someone here in the audience or on Twitch who wants to maybe pursue this kind of thing, a book, a reference point. If you are able to write it down, that's awesome. If not, I will get it from them and tweet it out from Game to Grow. So what advice or book or reference would you give the audience if they're wanting to learn more about this field?
Well, I'm a big fan of the Lazy Game Master's Guide. If you guys haven't read it or haven't heard of it, it's just a great resource. A lot of people get stuck in the place of trying to plan too much for their games. Peter. It's basically a lot of tools and tips and tricks on how to streamline some of that process and how to take some of the work off the game master. And some of that is just stuff that you don't really need to do. You can do this in a much faster fashion. And some of it is handing tools and handing pieces to your players and having them do some of that work.
I actually have to echo that. I used to spend a week working on story stuff, and it was dumb. Now I let the players figure out their own story, and I just work on focusing on the behavioral or whatever we're wanting to apply here. So the Lazy DM's Guide, absolutely wonderful resource. Yeah, it's saved me so many hours of prep time.
That's a great recommendation. Usually what is like causing me concern is how do I communicate what we're about to get into when I'm talking to another therapist that may be co-DMing with me, or I'm talking to a player who's never been exposed to D&D before and they just don't know what to think or feel and they need some kind of orientation. When I'm talking to the player, one of the things I might recommend is some of the videos that Matt Colville has up on YouTube, especially is like, so what is D&D? Or welcome to D&D, that's the name of that video. It's just a nice intro orientation. And then Elizabeth, that panel we went to this morning.
Yes, so I went to a panel this morning called Game Designer Breakdown Dungeons & Dragons, and it was recorded. And that was it was a 1 hour, beautiful slides. Just like lecture about here are a ton of the mechanics about D&D. This is what they are and also why they exist. And that can be really, really helpful when you're deciding what pieces you want to pull in or throw out. The other thing I would recommend, if you're interested in doing this therapeutically, is get trained up in group therapy. Group therapy looks really different than individual. I think something that fits really well in this would be interpersonal process. So any of Yalom's books are great.
Mm-hmm.
One book, just to throw out another reference for you, our friend and colleague Sarah Lynn Bowman did her doctoral thesis about the functions of role-playing games and wrote a book called The Functions of Role-Playing Games. I suggest you check that one out. When Adam and I first got started, we read that one, and it has a sort of a sociological perspective on the functions of role-playing games. That one's fantastic. It's on Amazon. I think we have time. Adam and I, when we did a panel at PAX South, we got a question from the audience, which was, how do you know this works? Like, what is an aha moment that you carry with you? I ask questions about doubters in the form of parents or teachers or players who are a little bit skeptical. How do you push through any of that self-doubt? What is that story that you go to in your head where you go, gosh, I know this works?
This isn't a story, but we have numbers. So research. We've done a little bit of QI research with the VA and found some pretty exciting, significant results. And Game to Grow is we're about to start a research project, again, to get a little bit more of an understanding of what this game is doing, how it's helpful, and maybe some places that we can scaffold. So those numbers are something that, in addition to the stories I go back to, I find are really helpful.
Yeah, we're actually big fans of the god of standardized testing.
Get out. I'm no longer talking to you.
Gotta have clerics somewhere.
Right here.
So I actually look at my current co-facilitator, who was in our groups. Started out very shy, very withdrawn, and over the course of many years, she attended these groups and became an absolute leader of these groups. And then it was her time to go off to college, and she was studying psychology, and the former co-facilitator I was working with, Dr. B, had left, and so I needed a co-facilitator. And we talked a little bit, and she now runs these groups with me while she's studying psychology and whatnot. And it's been incredible seeing someone who was a part of these groups now leading these groups and doing this work. So that is my sort of proof right there in front of me when I watch her standing up there running a game and just being fantastic. It's amazing.
I think, building on what Peter said, I think my real go-tos that happen, they keep getting replaced. We run a lot of groups, and so I get a chance to really see growth moments. More recently, we had a couple of players that we've been seeing for years that were in a group together, and they were just so good at playing off of each other and at building and role-playing with each other. And I found out that they were both in the same graduating time period, so they were the same age but at different schools, and they were graduating and they were going to room together in college. And it was just such a good moment. They both had come to the group with a lot of social isolation or a lot of challenges that were preventing them from really building some very close friendships. And they had gotten a chance just through the course of the group to build a friendship that they knew they could rely on each other, they knew they could trust each other, and it was enough that they had picked to go to a college that they would be able to continue to connect with, and that they, even further than that, wanted to hang around with each other all the time as roommates. And that was just a big success moment that I like to hold on to as I'm sometimes dealing with groups that aren't quite there yet.
So if you would like to know more about this, the work that we do, I have put some links up here. Feel free to take your phone out, take a picture of it. We will be here at PAX, this whole crew of panelists will be here at PAX, ready to answer your questions. We have a table in the expo hall on the 6th floor with Table Titans, so feel free to check out our table. We have merch for you to support our mission. Also, feel free to ask some questions there. If you have a question you want to know more about this, feel free to reach out to us at the contact form. We're more than happy to answer those questions. Can we give the audience a hip, hip, hooray?
Hip,
Hip, hip, hooray!
Thank you so much for coming. Have a great rest of your PAX. We have some cards up here if you'd like to stay in touch.